The following program is brought to you by the Ed Snyder Center for Enterprise and Markets at University of Maryland's Robert H. Smith School of Business. Welcome to the Ink Tank. Stay with us to get the inside scoop about technologies that could disrupt and challenge the way you do business.
Hello, I'm Christina Elson, and on this edition of the Ink Tank, I'll speak with Jennifer Gordon, the Deputy Director of the Renewable Energy Center. We'll discuss the conflict between the increasing demand for energy and the need to reduce our carbon footprint. Although the capacity for renewables is growing, they can't meet all future global energy needs. Jennifer, it's great to talk to you today in the Ink Tank, and we're going to talk about something that is a little different than some of the regular subjects that we have here. But for me, we're going to talk about energy, and for me, energy really is a foundational, fundamental driver of the fourth industrial revolution technologies that we've been talking about. So, how are we going to power our millions of robots? How are we going to send our ships to space? How are we going to do all this plus build and sustain the cities of the future? So let's talk about energy, the next 30 to 50 years of energy. What are the needs, and what is it that we are doing now to think through the kind of energy investments we need to sustain and grow?
So when we talk about getting from where we are right now at the end of 2019 to 2050, I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that the Energy Information Administration says that by 2050, world energy demand will have increased by 50%. So in light of everything that we know about a changing climate, everything that we know about increased greenhouse gas emissions, how do we meet that increased demand and also get our emissions to zero? And I think that's the paradox and that's going to be the struggle of the next 30 years.
Yeah, so a lot of the debate, we've heard a lot of discussion around the green energy plan, and there's a lot of terminology in there that I think is very confusing to people. We have green energy, we have renewable energy, we have clean energy, but can you break all that down for us and help us understand what is this? Like, what is the energy? What is the suite that's available to us?
Sure. So in my mind, renewable energy, it means that it comes from a source that is renewable. So something that exists, and no matter how much you use, there will always be more of it. So something like the wind, something like solar energy. On the other hand, you have clean energy, and that means zero or extremely low carbon emissions. So that can mean anything from nuclear energy, where, in the photos of the cooling plants, the image is steam. It's zero carbon. It is not gas emissions or anything like that. It's not carbon. To carbon capture and storage. So looking at the current extraction of gas and oil and saying, well, how do we decarbonize this system? To any number of other technologies, but that basically get us to zero. And I would argue that rather than choosing one or two or even a few technologies that we think should be successful, we should start by asking, what is our goal? And if the goal is to get to zero emissions by 2050, then that widens the tent. It expands the number of options that we have. And so, of course, renewables, I believe, are going to be part of that. But it also allows for things like nuclear energy, which can provide baseload power and can be reliable, clean, and always there.
Yeah, so nuclear is what you're saying. What I'm hearing you say is that nuclear is a really important part of this suite of tools that we need to research and develop and think about how to apply. This idea of picking what I think we saw some of recently or in the last decade or so was sort of picking some technologies, like saying it's going to be solar, it's going to be wind. And there was a lot of money from the government and even, private industry going into these but it was sort of, to your point, choosing a solution before we really fully identified some of the problems that we need to solve. So, um, what is it about? So, you got to this idea of fear about nuclear, like trust. What is it? Why? Where does that come from, and why is that not? How can we deal with that issue? Hmm.
Yeah, so I think again to kind of put a bow on the first point, I would say just to reiterate that we can come up with a system, or we should come up with a system that incentivizes zero carbon. So, I think that any serious energy plan has to look at a way of putting a price on carbon. I'm not saying that it has to be a carbon tax. I'm not saying it has to be cap and trade, but there are any number of ways of putting a price on carbon and then incentivizing technologies that get us to zero carbon. In terms of fear, and I think this is a really great topic, people have, rightly so, in their minds, ideas of 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, without going into, were some of these disasters exacerbated by human error? Can we innovate? Can we create new technologies that would head, these problems off at the pass? Nuclear reactors that would shut down in the case of a disaster so that you wouldn't have to have an operator standing there to do it. And I think, when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we're talking about breakthrough technologies and ways of getting from where we are right now to where we want to be. And I think, to say human ingenuity can't come up with solutions that will make nuclear energy safer, of course we can.
Yeah. So that's an important point because it sounds like what you're saying is that there is a lot of innovation in nuclear. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on? Why do we not need, older people like me, we need to get these images of, 3 Mile Island and these giant, reactor smoking things and, The Simpsons, right?
Right,
Yeah,
of course.
right.
That's my generation.
Yeah, get that out of our heads. So, what is there for us? What is new? What is innovative?
Right. And actually, I think it's the Department of Energy's Office of Nuclear Energy has, I don't know if it's a cartoon or a series, but it's what The Simpsons got wrong about nuclear energy. So, I definitely think we have to go to pop culture. We have to look at things like the HBO Chernobyl series and say, where do these ideas come from in the first place? But in terms of the fourth generation of nuclear reactors, I think we have to understand just how different that suite of technologies will be from what we know now. Even though I certainly believe that the current reactor fleet is extremely important. It's, it only produces 20% of U.S. energy and U.S. electricity, but it's half of our zero carbon electricity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big deal.
So that's a big deal. And if those start to come offline, as they have in some states, in recent months, I think that's a huge problem in our quest for zero carbon energy.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that the new nuclear technology is safer because it's leveraging other computing powers and other technologies that allow it to be better monitored and help eliminate some of the potential for human error. And are we looking at different ways of actually producing energy? We I I'm very interested in nuclear, so I've always loved, talking about nuclear fission versus nuclear fusion and, how are we going to do all this? But
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think before we even get to that point,
Mhm.
One of the big concerns is always, well, what do we do with the fuel, with the spent fuel? And I think that, two things on the newer generation is that they're trying to make it so that you can have the same amount of power, but with, a smaller amount of fuel to begin with. And then there's also the potential to recycle that fuel. So, and then, of course, fuel storage is extremely safe and highly, highly regulated. So I think that you have the two sides of this coin are innovation on the one hand and then regulation on the other.
So those two things are actually going hand in hand to make sure that as the industry is developing, it's doing it within a very clear set of safeguards and parameters. So, but there is room for innovation in this industry, and is there room for market-based innovation? So, are private companies going into this space? What are we seeing in terms of individuals sort of being engaged and involved in this? It's not just all top-down government
Oh, no,
investment.
not at all. And in
Mhm.
fact, in the US especially, because we don't have state-owned nuclear enterprises, unlike in other countries, we have this very open market for private sector companies to come and, figure out how do they want to build nuclear, the next generation of nuclear technologies. Obviously, probably the most obvious example is Bill Gates with TerraPower, NewScale, any number of other companies. But, I think that at some point, again, the private sector is not going to be enough. I think it's great that we have so much innovation coming from the private sector. Great that we have people, who are young, who are engaged, who want to build these things. But on the other hand, I think that in terms of being competitive and being competitive with the exports of other countries, I personally believe that the U.S. government has to value, on the one hand, the zero carbon energy source, and on the other hand, we have to place a value on the national security benefits of having a strong export program.
Yeah, so that gets us into an interesting point because, in the past when we heard presidents like, Jimmy Carter or whoever talk about nuclear, it was always from this security, like we want to make sure that the U.S. is secure in its energy resources. But now we also are thinking about leadership in energy technology. So it's not just the security, but it's leadership in energy technology. And why is it that the U.S. should have this role, in your view, and that we as a nation and with the support of the government and the private industry should be thinking about how to take a role in leadership in nuclear power?
I mean, I think the answer is pretty simple, that if we are not exporting our nuclear energy technologies, then other countries will, and those countries are China and Russia. And we have a culture of safety, a culture of nonproliferation, 123 agreements that other countries who engage with us and who are purchasing from us have to abide by. And so, if we don't want it to become the wild, wild west, and kind of anything goes and nuclear technology is just being exported by China and Russia around the world. And, again, who knows what that safety will be in nonproliferation standards if it's not us. So I think it's imperative that it be us.
Yeah, so it is still not only an energy issue, but also it's highly linked to safety and security for us.
Right. And I would also say, it's linked to diplomacy. Any country that we have an agreement with on nuclear energy, that agreement is going to be minimum 60 years. And so it's a way of creating diplomatic relations, for decades to come.
Let's build on that because that gets us to this idea of um, support, right? Political support for nuclear. And fortunately, we're starting to see this issue come back into a vibrant discussion of platforms. And there are a number of candidates who are talking more openly about nuclear. Um, what what is the nature of nuclear when it comes to people's, persuasions or political values or views? What do you see, and what are some of the challenges that you face in trying to talk to people and educate people about nuclear?
So first of all, in DC, in the policy space, I see nuclear energy as being a uniquely bipartisan issue. At the Atlantic Council, we've recently stood up a nuclear energy and national security coalition that is co-chaired by Ambassador Thomas Graham Jr. and Admiral Richard Meese, so Democrat, Republican, and our members come from both sides of the aisle, people who are extremely prominent, have held national security positions in, all administrations in the last several decades. Um, And so I think that it can bring in both Democrats and Republicans who care deeply about national security, as well as people who care about environmental security. In terms of the candidates, the Democratic presidential candidates, you see people who have to, they're not only talking to the DC policy elites, so they're people who have to take their platforms out into the country and talk to people who maybe don't think about energy or nuclear energy all the time. And so I think that, it's kind of a struggle. And I think in some ways, what I've been wondering since the town hall back a month or two ago is whether or not Elizabeth Warren maybe lost her footing for a moment. Because it seems to me that the day of the town hall, she had announced that she had adopted Jay Inslee's plan. But his plan allows for clean energy, which is basically code for, we are looking at nuclear energy. It's not just renewables. But on stage, her words were, to phase out nuclear, which seemed much more, adopting Bernie Sanders' plans. So my question is, is that just something that happened on stage? Is it something even that, she's saying in her campaign? And will that change? Has anybody sat with her and said, nuclear energy is so important to getting, to zero carbon emissions?
Yeah, that's a good point because, again, it's this term definition, right? So how are people talking about clean? How are people talking about renewable? But also there's a mentality that goes with it. And to me, that mentality is sort of a zero growth mentality. So if we're just going to have wind and solar and, whatever water mills and stuff like that, I mean, then it's like we're sort of getting into the zero growth mentality, right? And there is definitely an undercurrent of that right now. But I think that represents often a kind of a first world privilege in a way that isn't, we're not really thinking about the global needs or the needs sort of beyond, can I live without energy if we just don't have enough? I mean, it's I think what is it that is happening there that's facilitating this view?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it reflects a certain kind of privilege to say, let's have zero growth or low growth or whatever. And it's easy for me to think, okay, I'll turn off the lights, for a couple hours at night, or, I'll ride my bike today instead of, driving to the metro. But, I think that in actuality, it's not so much those things. Zero growth or low growth doesn't mean those things. What it means is, less power in a developing country where power is, and electricity is absolutely necessary. It means, a hospital having to go without 24 hour, without power 24/7. And so how can there be modern medicine without constant electricity? And in some ways, it reminds me of, the movement now, the fringe movement against vaccines, where I think that also comes from the privilege of never having experienced firsthand diseases like measles or polio. And so when you don't see it on a day-to-day, it's easier, or it can be easier to say, well, I don't really need this, vaccine, or I don't really need constant energy. But I think that's very anti-progress, and I think it's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about why you're so passionate about these issues, because you're speaking very eloquently about the need to help us figure out this next 30 years. And again, it's sort of akin to this issue with food, right? Like we have a lot to do. It's really important in the next 30 years or so that we get this stuff right. And I think that's such an important message, and energy is such a critical part of that. So why are you so, why do you care? I mean, you've got energy,
Right. True. It's funny because you're right. I do spend a lot of time, most of my professional life, thinking about the next 30 years. But by training, I'm actually a historian.
Okay.
So my PhD is in Middle Eastern history. And, I've spent a lot of time looking at past ideas about, how are we going to feed a pre-industrial civilization, looking at, how do people compete for scarce resources, back when the scarce resources were land and water, and arable land, not so much oil and gas. But I think that both of those threads, how are we going to feed all these people and how are we going to compete for scarce natural resources, both of these threads carry us into the present and then also are a bridge into the future.
Yeah, and I love that because, at the same time you're sort of looking at how do we not want to go that way, right? Like that there's all sorts of things that we can learn, and one thing we can learn is that we don't want to go back to that, right?
Right, and you
Yeah.
can't go back. I mean,
Right.
even if we wanted to go back,
Right.
Progress in my mind, the horse is out of the barn. We're, it's going whether we're going with it or not.
Right. Yeah. So with that foundation, what kind of trajectory did you follow? How did you go from thinking about these scarcity issues to thinking about nuclear?
Sure. So, my career path has been extremely circuitous. After college, I went into the government for about 4 years, then left to do a PhD, and then I was a stay-at-home mom for 2 years.
Oh, okay.
And, at the end of those 2 years, as my older son was going off to preschool, I started looking for any job in DC that, would be interesting, would involve policy, and most of all would involve writing. And I became a senior energy policy analyst at National Journal, on the client-facing side, not on the journalist, writing side. But again, energy, having looked at the Middle East, having studied the Middle East for so long, energy seemed like a natural next step. And I was very interested, too, in looking more at domestic policy and having the opportunity to work on domestic policy analysis. Because I also think that, looking at international policy, it's so complicated and it's very hard to have an impact. Whereas you look at, even the difference between federal policy versus state policy. If you want to have an impact, I think sometimes the more into the states, the more into the grassroots you go, the higher your impact. So it was a privilege really to work on domestic energy policy. And then now with the Atlantic Council as the deputy director of the Global Energy Center, where we mostly focus on the geopolitics of the energy transition. It's a way of combining my interest in energy with a love of international politics.
Yeah, so you said a few things there that I just want to reiterate to anyone watching this, particularly in colleges. One is you learn how to write, right? You know how to write. And two, you become an expert in an area, in this case, Middle East. I mean, you were thinking about it initially from a more historical perspective, but you really know and understand those cultures in those areas. And those are two really valuable skills that you leveraged into an area that you wouldn't initially have thought, oh, maybe I'll do this. But those are really foundational skills, right?
Right. And I would add, too, in this day and age where we all carry mini computers in our pockets and, the amount of information that's accessible to us, I think, is unparalleled. And anyone who works hard and who cares and writes and reads, it's never too late to pick up a new subject, to read more, to learn more, to find new passions. And, if you think your career's at a standstill, it's not. Just do something. And it's okay to be, to look back and have a resume that zigzags.
Yeah, I have a zigzagging resume, so don't worry about it. Yeah,
right.
resumes
And it's fine to not know what you want to do when you start off.
Right. Yeah. So for people that are interested in sort of the nuclear industry or policy policy area, what are the opportunities look like for them? I mean, there's probably a lot going on in energy or nuclear that you wouldn't necessarily think is an area that, oh, coming out of school, if I don't have an engineering degree or I'm not a physicist or something, what do I do with that? But you're mentioning that there's a lot of private companies. There's a lot of government work. So how would someone learn more about what opportunities are available for that? Because it seems like it's a growing area, right?
Right. I mean, I think that any job, that touches on energy, that touches on policy, touches on environmental issues, will likely involve a look at nuclear energy. So, the entry-level jobs that exist for people who care about policy, whether it's going to the Hill, going into government, becoming a research assistant at a think tank. I mean, there are so many things that you can do that would, I think, eventually lead you to a place like this.
Jennifer, I totally agree. Are there any last words you'd like to leave our audience with as we wrap up?
Sure. So I think to sum up the conversation, we've talked a lot about emerging technologies. We've talked some about policies, whether it's regulation, whether it's innovation, policies that encourage innovation, that can kind of spur this movement into the next generation of nuclear energy. And we've talked about public opinion. And I would say that it's really, really important that we get those three things, technology, policy, and opinion, to line up. And we've got to get them to line up at the same time, and always be working on each of those three prongs. And that's, I think, how we're going to get into the fourth generation and into, the fourth industrial revolution.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And it's the place that, we want to go. We're halfway there already. So let's make sure that we have what we need to support that continued growth and progress.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. It was great to have you today with me in the Ink Tank.
Thanks. Great to be here.
The U.S. needs to be a leader in global energy technology and the fight to reduce our carbon footprint. To do this, research into all clean forms of energy needs to be taken seriously, especially nuclear. Thanks to Jennifer Gordon for talking with me today. Until next time, this is Christina Elson in the Ink Tank.
Subscribe to the Ink Tank on Spotify, Google Play, and Apple Podcasts. A special thank you to the Kauffman Foundation for their support. From the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland, thank you for joining us in the Ink Tank.